What's up, guys? We are doing another live today. So we can get that glare out of the way. There we go. With Dan Stephenson. He is a ambassador for Subject Zero Subs. He is a coach, an athlete, powerlifter. Not necessarily one and the same thing, but that can be debated. And we are going to be going over conjugate training and how to incorporate that, and also conjugate training. So if that's something you guys are interested in, definitely stay tuned for that. Hey, what's up, man?
What's going on? How are you?
Doing good. How about yourself?
Oh, pretty good. Let me see if I get that volume corrected there. Okay.
Good?
Yeah. Yeah, I think so. I can hear you. We're
Oh,
good.
perfect. I apologize ahead of time that you're able to hear me.
Fair enough. Fair enough. So what's
So yeah,
new?
I was just kind of going over what we're going to be talking about today. I figured let's just get right into it. The idea of conjugate training. One of the biggest misconceptions about that is when people hear conjugate training, they immediately hear West Side, and those are two totally different integrated principles of training and philosophy. So I guess let's start with kind of just giving a definition of what conjugate periodization is, or conjugate programming. Is conjugate periodization the same thing as conjugate programming as well?
So I would say primarily I classify it more as like a periodization model or maybe a framework. So a systematic rotation of exercises that isn't necessarily designed to bring up like always the one rep max. So like you talk about with like West Side, that's the most commonly associated type of conjugate training with it. But no, I view it more as a systematic rotation of exercises designed to bring up multiple training qualities, either together or maintain while you bring up additional qualities. So it's rotating different approaches. Generally, those are going to be your strength, your power, hypertrophy, but it could also be conditioning aspects depending on the sport or who you're working with too. So
Yeah, I mean, with the idea of periodization, right, we're thinking about the undulation of different stressors to create the adaptation that we're trying to reach. And a lot of people can conceptualize periodization from a linear approach, going from like a hypertrophy block to a strength block to a power block to maybe a peak and block, right? But the idea of a periodization model when it comes to conjugate, when you're trying to work all different stresses at the same time, there has to be undulations with importance, correct?
yeah, I kind of view them as so you have your concurrent, which would be like your undulating or conjugate, and then you have your consecutive, which is a little bit more like your linear periodization or like your block periodization, to where that follows that more phasic approach, which kind of comes up to a natural peak. In terms of like the concurrent, undulating, and conjugate, they don't necessarily lend themselves to a natural peak. So that can leverage itself to be very useful in terms of who you're working with. So in terms of like strength sports or like, maybe like a field athlete to where they have like one competition to where they're preparing for, they're probably going to be better suited with something that's going to naturally peak them, or at least have some elements of linear periodization inside of that. But if you look at like athletes that are long-term seasons or maybe tactical athletes, people that don't necessarily need to peak, or maybe even gen pop potentially, then you can look at maybe these concurrent models to where you're still getting a training effect, you're still getting progress, but you're not necessarily, okay, our system goes up to this one rep max. So it doesn't have that natural peak in there. So I think that's one thing to kind of delineate in terms of the different types of periodization models, kind of breaking them into concurrent versus consecutive.
Yeah, no, definitely. But within that paradigm, right, you can have a concurrent model and treat it as a peak block as well, right? You can concurrently train and then throw in a 4 to 6 more linear peak block in there to get someone ready for a specific event, right?
Absolutely. Yeah, I personally believe the best programs take a bit from each. It's not necessarily going to be a black and white, this is conjugate periodization. Or, I mean, there's not many people that still do like a linear periodization
Right.
strictly the whole year round, right? So I think, yeah, really the best programs take a pretty balanced approach of okay, if we're peaking, we're going to go into something that looks a little bit more linear in nature because we need to prepare for that one specific date. So we need that application, that stress that's very specific. But conjugate, you can still kind of have a conjugate overlay and then drive that into like a peak phase or peak block, which you're talking about there.
Yeah. So conjugate is the idea of training different adaptations within the paradigm of a week. How is that differentiated between weekly undulation, weekly undulated periodization?
So the weekly undulating, I would call them more so cousins in terms of
Very,
how
yeah,
they work, right? Yeah, pretty similar in definition. Generally, with more of an undulating, you see that focus be one focus for the entire day. So like we're doing a strength day, everything's going to follow strength parameters. When we look at conjugate, it's going to be, okay, we have either usually commonly a max effort or dynamic effort is kind of the main thing. And then the accessories are generally going to be that repetition effort or that bodybuilding work to kind of build up weak points. So you might have some mixed variables in one training session. And then another big changing factor between the two is the rotation of exercises. You don't see that as commonly associated with undulating periodization. You're going to generally stick with the same exercises and undulate the stimulus that you're getting from that exercise, whether it's strength, hypertrophy, endurance, power. With conjugate, it's common to do a rotation weekly, sometimes bi-weekly, but the regular rotation, I would say, is more highly associated with a conjugate. But yeah, they're very similar in terms of their layout and how they're applied in terms of calendar or during the week.
Yeah. So that would be kind of one of the downfalls of a conjugate program for a specific sport, such as powerlifting, where you start to neglect the specificity of movement, right? So how do you counterbalance that? Because we know based on the science that neural drive, neural adaptation is one of the biggest drivers of strength. And specifically, specificity within that pattern is going to be very, very important for not only skill acquisition, but neural drive of that pattern as well. So how do you balance a conjugate program to allow someone to still get specifically good at the lifts that they're trying to compete in? Because it's not like you have to, it's not CrossFit for powerlifting where they're going to like roll out a thing and be like, okay,
Yeah,
today we're going to do safety squat bar 1 rep max for at the meet, right? Which probably
yeah, no,
powerlifting would be a little bit more fun, right? If they did that, you show up to a meet and you know you have to squat, you know you have to bench, you know you have to deadlift, but you don't know what variation you're going to do for that day.
that would be interesting. Pull out the chains or something too, like.
Right? But
Yeah, for sure.
if that's the biggest knock on conjugate training, how do you balance that?
So I think it's really not necessarily going to be the most beneficial for everyone. So I mean, when you look at somebody who needs a lot of skill acquisition, most of your intermediate to beginner lifters, those are going to benefit a little bit more from like a linear block periodization, in my opinion, to where they have that skill acquisition built in. With a conjugate, say if you do want to use a conjugate approach, you're never getting too far away from those specific lifts. So maybe rotating every other week is that straight bar competition weight, competition bar, and then the alternate week might be a variation, or your variations will be very similar. The said principle, if we look at that, specific adaptations to impose demands, it is very specific both in motor pattern, but also in physiological response, right? So if you look at going heavy with just, say, a Duffalo bar versus a straight bar, I would say that's pretty freaking specific compared to like potentially doing a straight bar for a set of 6 or 8. You know, I would almost say that was higher specificity because of that bar and that stimulus that you're going after being something heavy. You're getting that grinding skill or that max effort attempt. That specificity, I think, is something that's often overlooked when talked about it, is you can still look at the specificity as being the contraction type, what kind of time you're under the bar.
Yeah. So then, if that's the case, what would be the impetus for adding in variation to your weekly pattern?
So I actually listened to your recent podcast with the specificity debate. So I feel like I kind of agree a little bit more with Stu on that, where I feel the overuse potential is there when you do the same stimulus with the same type of bar, or the same kind of load. So I find personally, and with myself and then with people that I train, that generally the injuries are going to be lower, or like the aches and pains. Maybe not injuries isn't the best phrase to use there, but the aches and pains are generally less with some of that variation. And then if you are knowledgeable enough with the variations, you can specifically elicit an adaptation or weakness that they're getting, right? So like common one is a safety squat bar. That's going to fold somebody over. If they fold over with their straight bar, putting something that's going to emphasize that, like a safety squat bar, might potentially help them when they do transition back to that straight bar. So I
Yeah,
think, yeah, having them, go ahead.
I was going to say that's kind of where one of my arguments would lend itself to, is the idea that if you're folding over in a squat, by introducing a different bar that folds you over is going to build that weakness up, as opposed to just building up those muscles in and of itself. It just doesn't necessarily jive with me in terms of that making more sense than just keeping the specificity the same, but introducing different accessories to build up that weakness, as opposed to just finding a bar that exasperates that weakness to build it up. Because are you really building it up through a single, a double? Like, what are you actually building when you do that as a max effort lift? I don't really think you're building up anything.
Fair, yeah. I would say you're more exposing too. Like you're exacerbating something that is a problem or a weak point in an individual and forcing them to reinforce that area. I mean, you're still getting a strength stimulus, but in a slightly different pattern that's really going to challenge what their struggle is. So
So
I don't know.
then,
I understand like the argument that like one rep, is that really going to build it up? You could just layer in different accessories. I kind of view it as you could do it also in that main work, right? It doesn't always have to be specificity year round if that's going to cause somebody the potential to have to recover more. Like, a common issue, I guess, would be low bar squatting and elbows, right? So if you're constantly cranking back there into a low bar position, getting a bar on there, which is going to challenge the potential weakness of falling forward, and then also getting your arms into a position to where they're not going to have that same fatigue built up from getting into a position that you don't really own, which is that low bar. That is a potential benefit too, of an upside of, okay, we can still train, we can still push some load. And I'm from the belief that like your safety squat bar, like we should be strong in outside the groove, or pretty similar to the groove of what we're doing, because that should drive up our one rep max in our competition, because shit happens. We get outside the groove. Not every squat is going to be, a picture perfect technique, especially when we look at adding a bunch of load. So having that ability to pull yourself out of a shitty position by challenging that with a bar that's going to emphasize that, or potentially chains that are going to challenge that specific range of motion, I think can be very powerful and beneficial.
yeah, yeah. I mean, out of groove, right? You know what I think would fix being out of groove is if you just did the exercise over and over again, right? But I mean, I understand what you're saying. I understand that debate, and it can go on and on because there's not really much data to lend itself one way or the other.
Mm-hmm.
But with conjugate, I see a lot of value in it with athletes. I think that conjugate based principle of training different adaptations within the same domain of a day is very advantageous for athletes, because they only have 2 or 3 days in the gym, right? I'm thinking of like
Yeah.
any type of athlete that's in season, or any type of athlete that's even out of season, right? When you're adding in conditioning, when you're adding in all this other stuff, their time in the weight room is very limited. So how can you condense everything in to get the most bang for your buck? And I think conjugate plays a very valuable role in that ideology, not necessarily so much in the fact that they have to do max singles, but they have to do some type of max effort, strength-based work, and they have to do some type of hypertrophy work and some type of power speed dynamic, right? With the idea of restoration and rehabilitation being the biggest impetus for athletes, right?
Mhm.
So when it comes to trying to get all those adaptations trained at the same time, what have you found to be the order of importance in terms of being able to elicit the adaptation that you're trying to get in a day, right? Like you're not going to do endurance work first. Where do you start organizing that training day for an athlete?
So I would, I mean, almost like textbook NSCA style, right? Where you're going to look at power as being first, if you're doing power that day. And then it would just kind of boil down to like, okay, now we got our core lifts, our strength work, and then accessory or repetition type work following that, or endurance work for that matter, depending on what you're focusing on that day. I also wouldn't add in all of that in the same day, right? Where it's maybe pick like two or three that you're really focusing on. So if it's a strength day, like you have your big main strength movement and then a couple strength accessories, and then you're circuiting those with a little bit higher repetitions to get some of that endurance as well as hypertrophy in there. Or the alternate being like a dynamic effort day where you have your power-based exercise or speed-based exercise. Then you're following that up with maybe potentially energy system development, which is a little bit more anaerobic in nature, a little bit more sport specific, and then following it with like core or assistance type work, maybe some isometrics or supplemental type of lifts done in a circuit as well. So you get, again, a little bit of that conditioning and a little bit more of that endurance aspect involved.
So so then okay, so if you're eliciting those adaptations, say you only have 2 to 3 training days, are those full body days or are you undulating upper, lower? How are you doing that exactly?
So if I'm working with somebody 2 days a week, yeah, I'd probably do a template to where it's full body, to where you might even mix some of these stimuluses based on the muscle group. So maybe like a heavy lower body, maybe we're doing like a heavy squat that day, and then some kind of upper body power. And then we'd flip flop that. So upper body would be max effort on the second day, and then we have like lower body power after that. Because then you still get 2 times a week the full body stimulus and kind of hitting those foundational movement patterns, but we're getting the different stimuluses in there as well, not necessarily all focused on 1 day a week of just upper and 1 day a week on lower. I think that's better for most athletes just because sports aren't necessarily, devised in upper and lower. So
Right.
getting them a pretty mixed range, and then also the frequency of kind of alternating with that kind of a template, I guess.
Yeah, yeah.
3 days
So
you could probably.
so then my question would be to you, if this is kind of the model that you like, what leads you to believe that athletes get better by being bigger and stronger?
So I think more from the standpoint of resilience. I mean, to a certain point, an athlete needs to be strong, right? They don't necessarily need to be strength athlete strong or power lifter strong to where they're doing 3 times body weight squats and deadlifts, that kind of thing, or beyond that. So when we hit that point, then it's okay, is strength going to be the biggest factor, or size going to be the biggest factor that's going to improve their game? Maybe, maybe not. So that might be something where we're looking more at the individual, what they need. I would say that most, though, at least like who I see, a little bit more like, not professional level athletes, they're going to need a little bit of that size and strength for resilience, really. So getting them into positions, loaded in those positions, because they're going to be exposed to those on the field. So building up some tissue tolerance in terms of getting them loaded into these different angles and different positions that they may see on the field. So if they get hit, if they get, exposed to that in a cut or something like that, they're going to be comfortable with that, or at least comfortable enough because their body's been loaded in that position.
So it's not so much that they need to be bigger and stronger, but they need to build resilience through exercise selection and intensity. Is that more, or do you feel like size and strength lend itself to injury prevention as well?
I think it depends on the sport. It's not going to be beneficial for a runner, for example, to be very big, or like a jockey, right?
Right.
So it's really, I mean, there's kind of that athletic mold. If you look at like an ideal like mold for a certain sport. So looking at that is kind of building up to that point of like, okay, a lot of it's genetic too. I mean, like the sport kind of picks you, I guess, rather than you picking the sport by how
Right.
you're built, if you're lucky to find your sport. So if you look at that and then building enough strength or size within that to have a more robust system, robust body, to be able to perform the sport at a high level. So I don't know if I'd necessarily say, strength and size are going to be like the fix all for everybody. But when we look at getting an athlete faster, often it's going to be getting them stronger so that they can put more force into the ground, because that is something that they often lack if all they've done, say, as they've played sports, is unloaded movement. They've just played the sport. So giving them that application of strength, now we're adding that mass in terms of that force equals mass times acceleration. We're giving them a little bit more of that mass stimulus so that we can drive up the amount of force that they can put into the ground and therefore move quicker.
Yeah, because I always think about that from like a football standpoint, right? You'll see so many offensive and defensive linemen, and they'll do the combine, and they'll do like 18, 15 reps of 225, and you're thinking these guys aren't strong at all, and they're first round draft pick, right? Is strength really necessary? Can they spend their time using better utilize it towards something that actually matters more, right? Or is strength actually that important? I mean, one guy in particular, he was like an offensive tackle for the Alabama um, Crimson Tide, and he did like 9 reps on the 225 bench press,
Yeah.
and it looked like he never touched the weight a day in his life, and he was still drafted top 10 overall. I don't know how long his career was, but it's like when I see those things, it always makes me question, like, well, how valuable is strength? Should we make guys stronger? Should we waste time in the weight room with hypertrophy training, with strength training, or should we be focusing on other things like resiliency, like, skill acquisition within their sport domain, right? Things along that line.
Mhm.
And I always think about that when I see stuff like that, is like, do we spend way too much time thinking that strength actually matters within sports because we've been told years and years that it does. So we just follow that, good old boy system of like, well, I did it when I played, so now we're going to do it when you play, right?
Yeah, no, true. And I don't think there's a substantial amount of research that really shows that, the strength and conditioning aspect really affects that, which is interesting to think.
Right.
I do feel like, yeah, I mean, specificity, they're going to be playing their sport with the practice, right? So how we see it applied in most settings is, at least in season, like 1 to 2 times per week when they can get in, depending on what sport and what school prioritizes. But yeah, getting in maybe twice a week and just a little bit to get that stimulus and maybe build some resiliency. I would argue that strength really does help to build up that resiliency versus just playing the sport.
Yeah, but beyond strength, like I think of it in terms of like what other domains, what other potential could we spend the hour to 2 hours in the weight room, right? Like, could we work on deceleration? Could we work on body awareness? Somebody that I listen to a lot within the strength and conditioning realm of thing is Corey Schlesinger, and he talks about
Mhm.
how he gets his basketball players, and they just really don't know how to land. They don't know how to fall. So he'll get them in the wrestling room, and he'll have them doing tumbling. He'll have them doing, running where somebody pushes them over, right? And they're building up resilience through
Yeah.
that to build body awareness. And then they do like mini micro dose workouts of like 20, 30-minute exposures to heavy kettlebell throws and catches, release and catches, a lot of release and catch type stuff to help build some of that tendon, some of that deceleration mechanisms, and just getting people more comfortable with that. Not necessarily really trying to get them intensely stronger, right?
Yeah. No, definitely. I think that boils down to like GPP versus SPP. Like that is specific physical preparation. Like they're preparing for those like specific deceleration mechanics, reacting to getting hit. So that's going to be, I think, more your SPP work, which definitely is important. But I think the base of that really is from strength. I mean, if you look at somebody, I mean, this is maybe where it comes down to size as well. So if we have maybe a buck 85 person running at you, and then the teammate that's weighs way heavier and way stronger pushes them, like they're going to fall over, right?
Yeah.
So having a little bit of that resiliency of like, okay, I'm strong enough, I have a big enough base to where I can take that and remain the course. So the GPP naturally flowing into that SPP of having at least some kind of a strength foundation, because I mean, really, if you think about it, all movements are triphasic, right? They do have that eccentric loading, which mimics deceleration. We have an amortization phase, which is that isometric or that transition, and then the concentric phase or the explosive phase when we drive out of, say, maybe like a cut. That's going to be that explosive concentric phase. So we look at that. I mean, base building with some strength, and then I think that, as well as like, you know, looking at methods like the chaos method, to where we're doing things that are challenging people's reactiveness. I think that's really the important bridge of like SPP, of like, okay, what are they going to experience in the field? Now, how do we translate that from our gym, you know, all the weights and plates, all that more base level of what most people understand of strength training, into that SPP, that specific work of what's going to actually carry over, have a dynamic correspondence to what they do on the field, both in resilience as well as performance.
Yeah, yeah. So when you think about this stuff, how much do you question your own biases when you're coming up with these ideas, right? Because I was growing into this business. I was very much incubated with, you know, Joe DeFranco and Elite FTS, and that formed my basis of knowledge and biases. So whenever I start to question that with things like, well, maybe, you know, maybe getting somebody stronger in the squat isn't that important. Maybe getting somebody strong in general is not that important. It really forces me to look and challenges my biases. So whenever you're thinking about like strength is important, GPP is important to lay a base foundation. How much time do you spend questioning that thought process, right? How much time do you spend thinking like, yeah.
Yeah, no, definitely. And that's something I find myself, you know, looking at as well, is like, you always have a lens, like you always have a bias. Like me as a power lifter, yeah, that is a big lens of mine, or a big bias. So that is my initial go-to when I think of building up strength, is like, okay, we got foundational movement patterns like squat, hinge, push, pull, lunge, and carry, or locomotion. And then we want to load that, right? We want to build that up. So, yeah, I think, you know, following guys like Corey, as well as like Vernon Griffith, like, you know, some of these things, I forget the guy's name, strength and conditioning coach for, I think he just got traded or brought on by a different team, but utilizing a lot of these methods, which aren't very traditional, right? To where it's a little bit more like loaded mobility training, or what do we call it? I think Michelle Dalcourt calls it like farm boy strength, right? It's where we're working with like sandbags or vipers or load that's away from your center of mass, because most of our strength is a very controlled range of motion that we're loading, and we know what to expect from it. But if we look at, okay, maybe I take a weight and it's out here, like that's going to be a lot heavier, and now I'm going to move through space. So yeah, I think a lot of that, I mean, try to learn from as many people as you can, especially those non-traditional thinkers. So I think there's a, you know, a time and place for all of it. Like, and I think that's really the art and science of coaching, is like, how do you develop a good program to have that base and then actually transfer it into performance?
Yeah. Yeah.
That's what, yeah.
That makes sense,
It's
right?
hard to, yeah, super hard to quantify via research too, right? Because it's like, what kind of program is going to be, or a study is going to follow a program for that long,
None.
be that invested? Like,
Right.
yeah.
Well, then that would also require getting the egos of a strength coach and a researcher to be on the same page, and that's never going to happen,
Yeah.
right? But I think, like, so whenever you're thinking about this idea of trying to elicit a plan, what are some of the thoughts that run through your mind in terms of assessing what that sport needs, and then also what that player needs, right? And I guess to make it a little bit more specific, I'll give you an example. When I think about training athletes, I think about where do their injuries lie? What does the
Yeah.
non-contact injuries look like? Okay, that's non-contact. How can we prevent that? What are we looking at with prevention of non-contact injuries? And then also when people get injured with contact, what can we do to prevent that, right? Those are the two biggest drivers when I'm dealing with athletes, is like injury prevention, because if they're hurt, they're not getting paid, they're not getting a scholarship. So how can we prevent that? And then from there, I lay out the foundation work of what they need and what they need to work on, right?
Yeah, no, certainly. I think that's number one when you're dealing with, especially a paid athlete, right? Is like they're already at that level to where you just got to basically make sure they don't get hurt.
Yeah.
But when you look at maybe a developing athlete, somebody in like high school, it's like, okay, we got to look at the individual, like both how they move, like do they have any glaring deficiencies, like their squat, for example, like are they up on their toes or like pain, anything like that, where it might not, it's an easy fix. So like, okay, we can look at what is going to make their foundational movements that much stronger. So we got to look at that. And then also, if you look at the sport, yeah, think of most common injuries, like you were saying, both contact, non-contact, trying to lay down potential. I mean, we can only do so much, but as a strength and conditioning, like we want to lay down some kind of potential stimulus to build up maybe some resiliency in that tissue, and slightly mimic some of those same positions or loading mechanisms that they may face in a little bit more of a controlled environment. And then I would say 2 or 3, I guess, we're looking at time and movement analysis, right? So we look at the energy system development, like what is their sport? What kind of time are they doing, like their play or their contraction? Is it, what contraction type is it? Is it isometric? Is it somebody like, doing Brazilian jiu-jitsu to where they're grappled in with somebody for, however long that match goes or that round, or maybe a football lineman to where they're really hugged in tight to somebody, basically boxing somebody. So they're going to need maybe a little bit more of that isometric strength versus, a different, like say a running back, for example, that's going to be very like explosive. Like they're not necessarily going to be in as much grappling as the lineman may be. So really looking at specific positions, maybe even styles. So if you look at, different like MMA fighters, for example, like if they're more of a stand-up person, we may kind of gear the training for that, versus if they're more of a grappler, we may gear that more towards being on the ground, or more so looking at what they lack, or what they could benefit from more of doing. Like if it's more related to their style, then we can look at maybe layering that in with the strength, or with the training, I should say.
Yeah, and I think simplicity with youth athletes is overlooked so much, right? Like I'll
Yeah.
see high school kids, middle school kids doing strength and conditioning programs, and they're doing death jumps, and it's like they have no business doing death jumps, right? They have no business creating force and then redistributing that force to accelerate them on the sun. It's like they don't even know how to land yet, and you're teaching them to land in an awkward position and then generate force. It just doesn't make sense. So simplicity with youth sports is something that I think is overlooked so much, man, because people try to make it complicated because they see YouTube clips and these clips, and they don't really fully understand physiological responses to training modalities. And I think when you look at someone like a Jim Wendler, who's really honed in like strength and conditioning for high school kids, it's very much the same repetitive things over and over again, keeping it as simple as possible and doing things that create safety, right? Like he has them doing trap bar deadlifts. He doesn't have them doing straight bar deadlifts. There's no reason to ever have an athlete do a straight bar deadlift when you have a trap bar, right? There may not ever be a reason to have an athlete squat completely ass to grass. There may be, but there may not be, right? So it's always trying to, like we talked about before, underline our preconceived biases. And as powerlifters, and when I see powerlifters going into strength and conditioning programs, it's like, we got to squat, bench, and deadlift. It's like, well, why, right? Why do we have to do that? What's the purpose of these things? And it doesn't make sense. And is it what the athlete needs? And I think that's one of the biggest, most important things is needs analysis and then stress management.
Yeah, certainly. Yeah, I mean, bringing it back to like conjugate, most people think of it for powerlifters, right? So their dynamic effort work is always with a barbell and chains or bands or something. But like, yeah, I mean, realistically, it could be jumping, it could be tire flipping, it could be a prowler like shove, something like that, to where it's going to be a little bit more specific to what that individual is doing. It doesn't have to be with a barbell, nor does it have to be with accommodated resistance. But yeah, I think that is something, the general bias behind like power lifters or people that, really associate conjugate with West Side is it's very trapped into that powerlifting bias for sure.
Yeah.
But yeah, like you said, I mean, high school or very like youth athlete, like they really need more of a long-term development approach. Having them like Jim Wendler, having them earn the right to get under a barbell by, I forget what weight he has. I think 100 pounds or something like that, like a 100-pound goblet squat for
Yeah. Something
20
like
reps,
that.
I think is his. Yeah, like that's brilliant because like they build up the strength there, they build up the upper back, they build up the core capacity before they even touch the barbell. So he might have like juniors or seniors that might not hit the barbell in his program, or they might not hit it until they're seniors, right? Or
Yeah.
they come in as sophomores and they're working goblets or something along those lines to earn the right to get to that point.
Yeah.
I mean, really, the barbells.
Right. Having a tier system seems to make the most sense,
Yeah,
right? To earn yourself that right to that. I know Joe Ken was really big on tier systems, and a lot of really good strength coaches are as well. To think you're going to get somebody new into your program, and then they're going to be doing the same thing that your seniors doing or your 5, 6 year veterans doing is just
yeah,
asinine, right? You're setting them up for failure on many levels. And just like we were talking about with strength athletes, right? To have them build that base and skill acquisition in the very beginning instead of having them like when I see beginners doing conjugate and they're using so many variations, it's just like you're just setting yourself up for failure on so many levels within our
oh
sport. The
yeah,
sport is very simple. There's no real need to overcomplicate it. And even within a conjugate system, right, just having slight variations, slight tweaks, that makes sense, right? That's the biggest thing is that it has to make sense. Why are we adding a variation in? And if somebody's just saying, well, I felt like doing X, Y, and Z for the variation,
yeah,
that's never a good reason, right? Like there is some research on bands and accommodated resistance. You can look into that research and see why, when, and why it could be applicable, right? Those are the things that I look at when it comes to like a conjugate program, right? And like you said, right? Build that base foundation, skill acquisition, maybe higher frequency competition lifts to begin with, get very, very strong at that, get very, very competent at that. And then at that point, you may need some type of novel stimulus thrown in every now and then to generate progress in a continued manner.
yeah, definitely. I feel like it's better suited for the more advanced like strength athlete if you're looking at layering it into powerlifting. And I know that could be debated as well, but they will generally see, I think, more the wear and tear just because of the weight and the years that they've accumulated doing straight bar lifts, really building that skill acquisition. But doing the variants at that point, when you have years of base building, it's kind of like riding a bike. Like over the past year, I haven't squatted with a straight bar for probably maybe 5 to 10 times. And I've been pushing the squat with the Duffalo, safety squat bar, transformer bar, and I've been able to add more than what I've done previously for 1 rep max, like for multiple reps, with a little bit of transition going right back to a straight bar. So it's like Duffalo bar for a little bit, then transition with a dynamic effort cycle with the straight bar, and then start to load that more into my heavy work. So, I mean, it's doable, and it's not like it's, the 1 rep max strength is going to be there immediately. Like there is some skill acquisition, but for the most part, it's not like I forgot how to squat, right? Or with a straight bar, I just need a little bit of exposure, and it's like, okay, I got this, and I could go back in. So I think the more advanced lifter, or at least somebody with a good base, could benefit from conjugate from that standpoint for their longevity of training.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I love hearing your thoughts and Stu's thoughts, even though I don't necessarily agree with them. It's always good to get different ideas and different concepts out there, right? Because, it's important to. It's important to know that you can get to the same point using different methods. And just because I bias one way, you bias another way, doesn't mean either one of them are wrong. You just have to understand the concepts behind them. And when you have guys like you and Stu being able to talk about variations and how to use them effectively, that's the important thing more so than the method in and of itself.
Certainly. I mean, any good program follows the same principles, right? Like it needs the said principle in there. It needs overload. It needs to respect gas as well. General adaptation syndrome. Like as long as those are fit, as well as the individual needs, like it's going to work as long as the fatigue and the stress is managed along those lines, right? And that's part of the gas principle as well. So
Yeah.
yeah,
I'll have to
multiple
have you on
approaches. There's
here.
no,
I'll have to have you on here again to talk about the gas principle, because it's not something that I necessarily agree with 100%. So we'll have to
okay.
talk about that another day. But this will be it for today, man. I appreciate you coming on and talking about conjugate training for both strength athletes and athletes in general.
Yeah, appreciate you having me on.
All right, buddy.
Looking forward to that gas
Yeah,
talk.
yeah, definitely, man. Have a good weekend.
All right. Thank you. You too.
All right, bye.
Bye.